Yes, hello everyone. My name is Arthur Polyakov. I'm a managing director of a company called Advantix and also executive chairman of Minex Forum. Today we're running our webinar on public perception of mining. The public perception of mining is an issue many different organizations are wrestling with at the moment. The need is heightened by the dwindling number of students applying to study earth science courses at the universities in many countries. Quite frankly, mining has a dreadful public perception, and in many countries, miners probably rival bankers and politicians for the most untrusted people. If we want to correct this misconception and get better students studying geology and mining, then we need to be proactive and stress the importance and positive aspects of mining, particularly at the present time. We have today invited experts from leading universities and businesses to share their views, and at the webinar, we called Improving the Public Perception of Mining. Let me introduce you to our chairman today. It's Dr. Mike Armitage. He's a resource geologist with SRK Consulting and has over 30 years experience in the industry. Prior to joining SRK, he worked on the gold minings in South Africa and Zimbabwe and also completed a PhD assessing alternative methods of reserve estimation at Renko Gold Mine in Zimbabwe. At SRK, he is responsible for managing feasibility studies at stock exchanges, competent person reports on behalf of mining and exploration companies, and also audits and due diligence studies on behalf of investment institutions or in support of mergers and acquisition. He has also significant amount of resource estimation experience and companies encompassing a number of copper projects. Has written several papers on resource and reserves estimation methodology and spent several years as joint course coordinator in mineral resources at Cardiff University. And then he was an external examiner in the metals and energy and finance at Imperial College, University of London. During his time with SRK, Mike has been a managing director and chairman of UK practice and also of SRK Group.
Thanks very much. We do have an interesting panel to discuss this topic, and it's a topic that we've been quite focused on in SRK for several months now. We've got an initiative going to try to do what we can to try to improve the perception of mining in the public domain. And in sort of working through that, we've been collaborating with a few people. We've been discussing this with quite a few people, and the people that we've got on the panel today are mainly the people that we've been chatting with. And who we think will have something interesting to say, and hopefully, we'll get some initiatives that will come out of it. So anyway, on the panel today, we'll have, and I'll let them perhaps all just say a few words themselves, but just briefly, we have Professor Ian Stewart. Ian and I did our PhDs together a long, long time ago, but he's now a Professor of Geoscience Communication at the University of Plymouth. We have another academic, Mike Pearl, who's Professor of Geology at Oxford University. And I'm hoping that they'll both be able to give us some insight into how easy it is to attract students to do, or difficult maybe it is to attract students to study geology and mining these days. We've got Mark Steeves, who has been involved in the mining industry for over 30 years as an advisor, originally with HSBC. He now runs his own company called Samphire. Mark and I are involved in quite a few things together on GeolSoc, and I know he has some strong views on this subject. We've got Alan Davis, who is currently on secondment to ICMM, who I think is looking into a project that is trying to get people to collaborate to discuss mine closure and also how people deal with land post-mine closure. And finally, a colleague of mine, James Davey, who is recently awarded his PhD in geology and who has been with SRK for a year or two now, I think, James. I can't recall, time seems to fly. and who has been involved in this initiative with us and has been perhaps one of the main people who's been driving it forward. Maybe we hand over to Ian first. Ian, do you just want to say a few words?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So Professor of Geoscience Communication, which means I just kind of basically talk to anyone who'll listen about Earth, the planet, what it means for us. I'm director of the Sustainable Earth Institute at Plymouth, which is an interdisciplinary group, a lot of it around communication of geoscience. And the other main role, I guess, I've got is I'm a UNESCO chair in Geoscience and Society, and I lead a UNESCO project on geology for sustainable development.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, who's next up? Mike?
Yes, hello. I'm Mike Searle. I'm a professor of earth sciences at the University of Oxford. I've been there for over 30 years, and I teach structure, tectonics, and metamorphism across the range of our undergraduate students. I've had several DPhils, PhD students, and master's students working on various projects across mostly Tethys. I work mostly along the Himalayan belt and in Oman and the United Arab Emirates for my research. And I work a lot with Professor Lawrence Robb, who has just stepped down from being president of the SEG, who is the real expert on ore deposits and minerals in our department.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, next up, Mark.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm the only non-industry person. I'm not a geologist. I'm not an engineer. I've worked mainly in the oil and gas industry during my 30, 40 years of business career. And when I first came into the oil and gas industry, it was a very, if you will, exciting industry to be going into, which people would say, "Gosh, how exciting for you! You're going to be making lots of money, and what a great thing to be doing." Mining, I would meet miners on business trips and so forth, but it had generally a lower radar. But of course, in recent years, particularly with new developments in IT, etc., it's got a much higher profile, but not necessarily a very good one. And so that's what this is about. It interests me very much as a subject. I've been working at the Geological Society, as Mike mentioned earlier, for some years on a couple of committees there, and have become, if you like, more and more excited by the way in which the industry that I've been a part of, both the oil and gas and latterly mining, has become less seen as a good industry to be in.
Thanks, Mark. Alice.
So I'm currently an environment manager at ICMM. I'm the mine closure program lead, and I'm also involved in the water and tailings work that they're undertaking this year. So ICMM is the International Council on Mining and Metals, and their vision is to basically make mining and metals a respected industry that's trusted to operate responsibly, as well as contribute to sustainable development. ICMM members include 27 of the largest mining companies and 36 national associations as well.
Thanks, Alice. James, how are you?
Yep, so my name is James Davey. I'm, as Mike said, I'm also a resource geologist based in Cardiff in the UK. My background is mainly in mineral exploration and academia, and most of my work has been focused in Central and Southern Africa, primarily in the Central African Copper Belt.
Great, thanks, James. Okay, so I mean, I've put together a few questions really just to get the sort of conversation going, and I mean, I think I would think that most of us do think there is a fairly negative perception of geology and mining in the industry, but I guess the question is how do we know this? Is this something that's just anecdotal, or is there any hard evidence out there that says that's the case, and maybe says if there's a trend in what's going on? I mean, Ian, is this something that you can perhaps comment on?
Well, I think certainly, I think within UK geoscience departments, there's a real big concern about falling numbers in terms of going into courses. And when we kind of ask teachers and we ask some of the students about what's underneath that, it's very complicated. There's a lot of different things, but certainly there's a sense of a lack of excitement about some of the industry areas that maybe previously there was more. So I think in the past, you know, I learned my geology in the 80s, and many of my people went through PhDs with us. Me and Mike, we went into oil and gas, went into mining, and it was both seen as quite exciting disciplines or sectors to go into, very well paid, etc. I kind of think that what we're seeing is a complex mix of the traditional areas of mining and oil and gas, etc., not being as appealing as industries. That's partly because other industries are coming in that maybe are more appealing to science-minded people. I think there is also other aspects come through with environmentalism and climate change, particularly in terms of the younger ones that are coming through that we're seeing not more motivated towards the environment. And in that context, seeing mining is not an obvious place to go. So I'd say it's, from my point of view, it's two things. It's talking to university students, undergraduate, master's level, as less attracted to get into mining than they were, I think, even 5 years ago, but definitely 10 years ago. And then talking to lots of people in the industry where there's certainly that view is coming across, which is, I think, more anecdotal.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's always been there, you know, because, you know, any film, it's always the mining guy or the oil guy is always the bad guy. You know, I mean, you very rarely see a film where the geologists and miners are, well, maybe geologists are different, but certainly miners are portrayed in a negative manner. So I think
volcanologists are the only ones that get away with it, really. Cool.
Yeah, the glory boys. Yeah. I mean, Mike, did you notice falling numbers of people applying to do geology, or maybe a reducing quality of the people applying to do geology, or not?
Well, in Oxford, we don't see falling numbers because we're quite lucky as being the one of the places that a lot of students want to come to. But what I have seen is a increasing trend with the spread of the whole diaspora of geology in our field, that the fall of people actually wanting to do hard rock structure mining in amongst the students is actually pretty large. And I've been really worried about this for a long time. And part of it is that our whole subject has expanded dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years. So we now include all sorts of branches that in the past, 20 or 30 years ago, would have been included in physics or chemistry or maths modeling or climate change with the rise of that. And I see the problem as being threefold. One is that geology is actually not taught in many schools. And I think that's the root cause of all the problem. Where it is taught in schools, it's generally as a sort of sideline of geography and not taught very well, to be honest. The other one is the sort of perception that field work is hard work, and a lot of our students actually don't want to do it. Most of them are the sort of mathematical modeling types rather than the people who got in there because they like volcanoes or dinosaurs or whatever. The third one is actually funding, because it's almost impossible now to get funding from the traditional sources of the government funding agencies to do field-based hard rock geology. So I think the problems stem all the way back to teaching geology in schools, to the perception of geology and mining in higher education, and that leads on to a whole bunch of other problems which are to do with sort of politics and environmental constraints and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, when I studied geology, I did geology first at A level, and it was the first subject I ever really enjoyed. It was the first thing that ever sort of gave me any real enthusiasm. And I had a teacher who'd worked on the copper belt in Zambia, and you know, I've no doubt that it was because of him that I became a geologist. And you know, I don't know if there's any hard evidence for it, but I know, James, you know, we've looked into this a bit in work. Isn't there a feeling that once you get people to study geology, they tend to get hooked? So a lot of people that study geology at A level go on to do geology at university. So the challenge is very much getting people to study geology in the first place, getting geology into the schools and the A levels. Because once you've taught it, then a certain number of them will be hooked and will go on and study it. I think the conversion ratio is much higher in geology than in most subjects. Did we get some evidence on that, James? I can't remember. There was some study, wasn't there, that we looked at?
Yeah, I guess Ian or Mike probably better placed to comment on the numbers, but I think it was just under half conversion rate, which, given that most people take 3 or 4 A levels, is a pretty high conversion rate for an A level. So it's all about getting, as you say, getting people into geology at that kind of GCSE into A level kind of age group, as opposed to retaining them once they're doing it. I don't think that's necessarily the issue.
Yeah, I think that data comes from the Earth Science Teachers Association that did a poll of with about 3,000 students, and of the classes, something like up to 50% of the class that did A-level geology went on to study geology. And it's worthwhile, just in the context of Mike's point, differentiate between two kind of intakes, because there's an intake into, for example, at Oxford and Cambridge and Durham and a few places where they have a natural science intake. Students come in at a very broad level, and then you have this jostling in first year and you try and pull them across. So what you find is lots of people who are geologists today who will say, oh, I never did any geology at A-level. I discovered it some other way. And then there's another set of kind of courses in Plymouth and Portsmouth and Leicester and things like that are much more, you come straight in to do geology. And so if you don't have that familiarity of what it is, you're not going to choose it. And so I think that there's, we do need to really look at that school. The schools, it's not the only place the problem is, but I think it's as Mike says, it's a big issue. If we can try to address that, that will help.
And is there any evidence, Ian or Mike, even that the quality of the students studying geology in preference to anything else is getting worse rather than better?
Well, I don't know. I won't let Mike speak for his area, but we see a lot more coming through geography. And as Mike says, the way that the geology bit of geography is taught presents us with some problems. So they don't tend to be very mathematically minded as well. It tends to be sometimes it's geology. If they have got A-level, it's because that's their science. So if they are doing maths, physics, chemistry, they tend to go off somewhere else. I don't know. Mike, do you want to talk about it? Do you see it the same way?
Sure. Well, you can't even get into our course, which is now called Earth Sciences rather than Geology, without maths, physics, and chemistry. Geology and geography are no longer essential. And, 2/3 of our students have never done any geology by the time they arrive as an undergraduate in Oxford. But having said that, I always am on the lookout every year for 2 or 3 of the good students to do my courses, which are generally hard rock, tectonics, structure, metamorphism, and the ones with Lawrence involve mining ore deposits of some sort. And we have no problem at all getting some of the best students in the class, because I think you're absolutely right, Mike, that once you've got that geology bug, it's there forever.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest problem is getting that across at the low levels, schools in particular, and how you change that school curriculum is a big problem.
If I may, the problem with getting students is absolutely connected to the question is, how do we know that there's a negative public perception of geology and mining? I don't suppose that the general public has any particular perception, negative or otherwise, of geology. It is about whether it gets introduced, the public gets introduced to the subject when they're at school. I think that's clear. But the negative regard in which I believe mining is perceived is another issue. And I think that's, if nothing is done about that, then it's going to be difficult to attract students to the subject, whether or not they are introduced to it at school.
Yeah, I think even in geology, though, Mark, there have been reduced number applying, even though, and anecdotally, I think a lot of it is an association with the mining and the oil industries. But I mean, James, you're the most recent graduate here. When you were doing geology at university and A-levels or wherever, do you have any concerns about what business you were getting into, or any concerns about getting into the mining business?
Personally, no. I mean, I was dragged over to the dark side pretty early on, and I was quite keen on it. But I know certainly from kind of teaching and demonstrating during my PhD that admissions numbers were rising on the environmental and atmosphere and ocean-based courses at Southampton, and generally declining on the hard rock side of things. So I think reputation is a factor, but I think also, as Mark said, we're talking about public perception more widely, and I think it's something that we probably shouldn't tar with the same brush. And around the world, different countries, different age groups, different generations probably have different perceptions. So obviously we've talked mainly about the younger generations and their perceptions of the mining industry, but also in other countries where there's well-established mining industries, in Australia or South Africa, for example, I'm not sure necessarily that the perception is as negative as perhaps we're used to in Western Europe. And perhaps it's just a sense of kind of a complete lack of awareness in the UK, certainly, in the general public, about where things come from and how that feeds into everyday life and every kind of bit of technology that they hold and use. Whereas I think in other countries, that kind of supply chain is a lot better understood. And I think when it is better understood, with some obvious notable exceptions, there's perhaps less of a negative perception in those areas.
The thing is, if I may, the perception you're talking about there, for instance, in South Africa, yes, the mining industry is fundamental to the economy of South Africa. It's what the country was based upon, founded upon. Same in Australia. But in South Africa, for instance, I sit on the board of this little, on the advisory board of this little investment bank in Johannesburg called Moshe Capital, and their strapline is inclusive prosperity. Why? Because the company is run by two black women. They're advantaged by black economic empowerment, but they are not advantaged naturally to become involved in the mining industry. Mamecha Moshe, the founder of the company, talks about her upbringing in a mining area where bluntly all the mining people in authoritative positions were white and had electricity, and all the workers were black and didn't have electricity. So that's a reason for a bad perception of the industry. So it's not true to say that the perception is all good in places where mining is a big industry. I don't know what the perception of mining was in the 1920s or the 1930s in Wales, for instance, but it wasn't run for the benefit of miners. It was run for the benefit of the people who owned the land and who financed them. And this modern world we live in cares, if you will, about ordinary people and what ordinary people's experiences are, and that's where perception comes from.
And I guess the second question that I put up with, which was, what one of the reasons for it is we've sort of been covering. I mean, and as you say, there's the negative perception more generally in the wider public, and that is going to vary from country to country. I completely agree with James. I mean, it's in Australia, I'm sure the mining industry is seen in a much more positive manner than it is in the UK, and yet weirdly, the UK has a long and significant mining heritage, but I guess it's just getting too far in the past.
Yeah, I think actually on that, there's an interesting, just because we've been done a lot of work down on public perception in Cornwall around with the geothermal project. And actually what's interesting there is they are very proud of the mining, but it's very much seen as in the past. So if you then try and talk about contemporary mining, the Hemerdon Drakelands is just opening up, and they talk about South Crofty, people are a lot more reticent about the idea that mining might come back because they say it was horrible. All of that stuff down there, to be really wanted. So they kind of like it kind of packaged as a tourist thing in the past rather than something they'd like to see come back.
Yeah, well, I think when mining was at its height in Cornwall, it was widely regarded as the most polluted part of the world. And similarly, the mines, as Mark says, in Wales. I mean, I can't imagine they were great fun to work on when you were mining 30-centimeter wide seams. But yeah, so there's a lot to address there. I mean, Alice, I just wondered if because I think one of sort of the main driving forces for ICMM isn't that improving the perception of mining in the public?
Yeah, so there's multiple programs that ICMM run on environment, social factors that our members are interested in. But each one of those programs has an engagement platform where we encourage mining companies to publicize their good news stories. I mean, too often the mining industry is seen as not transparent enough. It's sort of hidden, and we're not really sharing the good news stories and encouraging that collaboration within the industry.
And did you ever have any second thoughts, or do you still have second thoughts about being involved in the mining industry?
No, not at all. I think my where I came at it from the environmental side, loving nature and biodiversity, was I'd much rather have a seat at the table and be able to help with the decision-making process and sort of guide mines to make more sustainable decisions than not have a seat at the table and sort of things continue as they had done. So I definitely feel lucky that the work I've done to date, I definitely feel like I've made a positive contribution, and that's what I wanted. So no regrets from me.
And is one of the aims to get more people to understand the positive things that mining can do, or is that not really part of what your remit is? Because there are good stories in mining as well as bad stories. Yeah.
Yeah, so as part of the closure program, we're trying to pull together a whole heap of case studies that we'll make available to the public on good closure examples where closure's been integrated from the start of exploration through operations and thought about a bit more. Another program is the social goal. So societal acceptance of mining is something that a lot of the organisation are working on, a lot of my colleagues are working on. Through collaboration on achieving an aspirational goal which relates to skills for the future. So what skills are going to be required in the mines of the future? Not necessarily, guys with pickaxes. They're going to be, remote controlled haul trucks, driverless vehicles, coders, all those kind of people.
And who are your members? Who are the members of ICMM?
We got 27, but it includes Anglo Gold Ashanti, Anglo American, Rio Tinto, Vale, MMG, Glencore,
majors and mid-tier companies, yeah.
Yeah. But we've also got association members as well, like mineral councils, those kind of country-specific sectors as well.
Okay. So I guess as we've discussed, there are problems with the perception of mining, and to some extent, geology gets dragged along with that. But I guess the question that stems from that is the next question. So yeah, is this something we need to be worried about? Is this something we need to do anything about? I mean, Mark, what are your thoughts?
I don't suppose it is anything new. I think that, as you said, it can't have been fun working a very narrow seam in the coalfields of South Wales in the 19th century. I don't think it's ever been something that ordinary people much wanted to do, and of course, big mining now uses a lot less people. It's a lot safer. It's a lot less. It's a lot less in your face, if you like. But the mining that is happening, on the other extreme, you've got child labor in the Congo, in the DRC, and so on. I think that somehow the industry needs to make a very big effort to, and I guess this should come from your members, Alice, from those big established miners, there should be a much bigger effort to explain what they're doing and the significance of what it is they mine. The Geological Society last year, I think it was, put out a poster with what goes into your mobile phone. And I mean, that was an extraordinary thing to look at for someone who just had never imagined it was anything but a bit of plastic. Yes, do we need to be worried about it? Well, yes, I think we do, because without people understanding where things come from and what they're made of and how they're produced, the manner in which they approach the world is like a ship without a captain. It doesn't. They don't know where they're going. People don't know where they're going. They don't understand things, and I think that this is a really serious problem we face, where experts. We've talked a lot at the Geological Society about the role of learned societies. That they don't get the regard that they should get, and they're seen as fusty and musty and dusty, and not as thought leaders, which of course is what they should be and are.
Can I come back on some of that, Mike, a little bit? Just
sure, yeah.
A few things. I mean, I think that from the communication side, I think there's two common mistakes that we make that is across a whole wide range of fields, but it's equally applicable here. The first is we start where we are and we say, right, what is it that they need to know? What is it our message should be? And really good communication is always starts with where the audience is. What are they interested in? What do they want to hear? And then the second thing is an assumption that what they need is more information, that they need to be educated about stuff. And what we see again and again is a disconnect between the awareness of people and the motivation to change behavior or to think in a particular way. So in other words, you can tell people things and they can say, okay, I now know that, but they're not actually inclined to change their behavior because they make those behavioral changes somewhere else. It's their emotion, their perception. It's not about evidence-led. And we, as science and technologists, have the wrong view, because we are people who we would like to think make those decisions based on evidence and data and all of this, but most people make it on intuition and that that fast, slow thinking, etc. And there's plenty of empirical evidence from that from social sciences. So I think the key thing is understanding in a bit more of a subtle way how people take in information and juggle the information. And I think it's the way it's framed. And in mining, there's three obvious frames: an economic frame, a kind of technological frame, and an environmental frame. And I think the economic frame is easy. Mine is very easy to demonstrate that it brings value added and it develops economies, etc. And the countries that have a lot of mining need that resource and need that money and investment. In the technological one, I think it's trickier because, of course, we know that mining's changing, but actually the real cutting edge is somewhere else. It's quantum computing, it's material science, it's machine learning, it's synthetic biology. Those are the really exciting areas for the 21st century. Some of that, like digitalization and machine learning, artificial intelligence, is coming into mining. It's coming into everything. So that's where they're going if you're interested in the technological side. And in mining, in many respects, is way behind the curve, way behind oil and gas, for example, on that. And then the last one's the trickiest. It's the environmental. So if you really care about the environment and climate change, you will almost automatically see mining negative. Sure, you can argue things about this bit's more sustainable, and you can argue about material needs for renewables, but it's a much harder sell. And so it's not surprising that we keep going back to the economic argument, which means that we're kind of losing the technological and the sustainability environment argument. So I think that putting more attention to those latter two to really pull out why mining is absolutely critical would be the thing that I would be focusing on.
I mean, Ian, one of the things I noticed in a slightly related area is that whenever geology or mining is mentioned on some program, if it's on the news, so for example, there's a money program that's on Radio 5 at like 6 each morning, which I tend to listen to as I'm sorting myself out in the morning. And very occasionally the story comes up about a mining company, and almost everything they say is incorrect. You know, there's complete lack of knowledge of mining. I mean, it makes me wonder whether everything I hear on the news is incorrect. But there's no doubt that whenever someone is talking about mining, the way they talk and the things they say just shows a complete lack of knowledge.
There is a deep disconnect in the public's mind with a lot of the traditional industrial aspects that we did. There's a disconnect with the subsurface, anything to do with the subsurface. We've shown that in Berkeley. People, even down in Cornwall, have a very huge difficulty trying to even imagine what it is like down there, the different conditions. And then also we've got a difficult things that are over the horizon, that are far away, that are distant, remote from us in some way. So that could be the upper atmosphere, the deep ocean, or underneath. So there's a whole series of disconnect. Most people have never seen a mine. They've never met anyone who's worked in a mine. I mean, that's a very big difference in the kind of latter part of the 20th century, early 21st century from maybe earlier on. Whereas if you go to places that are very familiar with that kind of industrial world, then it's much more attractive. So even if you look at shale gas and fracking in the States, it gets very negatively viewed when you get into Pennsylvania and places when it's not done much. Go down to Louisiana and it's very positive because people are very familiar with that environment. So I think familiarity, that kind of touches back a little bit to what we were talking about schools. Familiarity is one of the issues we deal with. People just don't see it.
There is one thing, if I may, there is one thing about the US which is important, is that I think is important, is that the price of oil is a real key fundamental in the economy. It's not heavily taxed, so people, they know exactly how the economy is by whether or not they can fill their tank as cheaply this year as they could last year. And one of the things about the oil and gas industry is it does have an interface with the public. People fill their cars with petrol. What is the interface that the public has with mining? I guess I'm thinking the only real big miner that has a real interface is De Beers. There's no BP in mining, not in the same way. I wonder whether that's some of it.
Mark, I wonder whether that's something that needs to be picked up on and progressed, because to use the kind of analogy with food and farming, I think it's been kind of grown over the past couple of decades that people with education are increasingly aware of where things come from and how they're produced, whether it be fair trade bananas or where their coffee is grown and then transported from. And I think, especially, to get back to the question of, is it something we need to be worried about in terms of perception, at a time when, as a population, we use a greater diversity of commodities than we ever have before, I think providing at least some degree of education about the diversity of commodities that go into everything that we use, and then I guess you're never going to be able to, educate the population widely in terms of where all of those different commodities come from. But there are a few key commodities, the fashionable ones like cobalt, for example, where we could really push the whole production through the supply chain, kind of just the education of how that all works, where it comes from, and I think that would make a big difference.
Alice, is there any movement like that in any of the initiatives in the ICMM that are geared towards that, or is it more focused on industry rather than the public?
So what I was going to say is I agree with James, and I see it two ways really. The question, is it something we need to be worried about? Yes, I think it is. I guess a concern that ICMM has is on sort of the tailings engineers and the technical experts that are going into the industry. Tailings is the least glamorous thing probably about mining, but it's crucial and it's not going anywhere for a while. So attracting that talent into the industry is really important. but the flip side is that it's a massive opportunity to diversify the skill set, the ideas, the people that are involved in the mining industry. So I guess it could go either way. It depends how you look at it.
And are your members from all over the world, Alice?
Yes.
All right.
Mike, one aspect of the previous question as well, just to really directly address it, is it something that we need to be worried about? I think, put very simply, if we don't change the perception, then going forward into the medium and long term, then we probably won't continue to attract the best candidates into the sector at all.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Can I jump in here?
Sure.
Yeah, I completely agree with what James just said. I think the problem with the mining industry is very much similar to the oil and gas, that only the bad news ever gets reported. So it's only the sort of Exxon Valdez and the Gulf of Mexico oil spills. It's only the big mining disasters that get reported. Yeah. And, 99% of the public have absolutely no idea that the mining industry provides things like your mobile phones, your computers, semiconductors, everything that we need to keep civilization going. And I think that's just a massive lack of perception that's out there in the public.
Yeah.
But it's one of those times where perception is reality, because it's perception that drives those decision making. So those perceptions may well be wrong, but it's how you change those perceptions. And what we know is changing those perceptions is not done by giving people information. That works for us, a certain subgroup of the public, but for most publics, they make the decision making on other areas that are much more important to them. They trust. Trust. Who do they trust for information? And so they'll trust friends and colleagues and influencers, etc. And we generally are not in that area. They will trust scientists, but they won't. They'll be careful about scientists that suddenly have got connections to industry or even sometimes to government. They'll trust some media people, but again, it doesn't really matter whether those media people have got expertise or not. It's just whether they trust them. So, how do we become trusted is one of the critical questions, and that goes through all the stuff around social license as well. Sorry.
I'm not sure I agree with you, Ian, actually, because I think if you look at plastics in the ocean, the whole David Attenborough series really absolutely kick-started that whole environmental thing. And it was one image of him cutting open a whale's stomach and finding all this plastic. And before that, the public was basically ignorant of the fact that plastics were producing this untold damage in the environment.
Well, that's kind of what I mean, though. I mean, that's because it came through Attenborough, it came through a media show that was very trusted, and it didn't come from scientists. At our place, we've got Richard Thompson for 20, 30 years has been talking about microplastics. It's been very hard to sell. A television program comes around, something like that, packages it in a particular way, and suddenly it's an issue. So that's kind of what I mean, is we need to take some of these issues and present them in a different way that breaks through some of those old barriers.
Ian, just in a similar way, a slightly obscure question, but one of my thoughts over the years has been whether, so if we know that one of the dangers that we face is that there could be some sort of massive eruption, I guess, but there seems to be very little progress made in terms of actually modelling potential volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. And even though we know where they all are, we're not in a position yet where we can sort of predict them. And a lot of people might say, yeah, but that's impossible, but I'm not sure it is. I mean, I kind of think what the weather forecast used to be like 20 years ago when they couldn't predict whether it's going to rain in 2 days or 3 days. But now you look at the weather forecast and there's models and plans and everything. It seems to have got its act together. And do you think that we're putting enough effort as geologists, or getting the right quality of people into geology to actually look at those things and actually try and get more ability to predict volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and so on? I just think that we just seem to be, almost giving up and saying it can't be. We know where they occur and we know roughly when they occur, but we can't actually predict them.
I think it's a tricky one. I mean, I think that the technical bit is really complicated, even for volcanoes, which is probably easier than earthquakes. But the really complicated bit is the socio-political bit. So even if we could had a technical precursor that we were pretty reliant on, at some point that science group has still got to say to a decision maker or a governor and to evacuate or not evacuate. And that's where it gets really complicated. And so I think that we're seeing it with COVID at the moment, is these systemic risks. So these are risks that come out of nature, of the geo world, but their implications, the ripples go right across society. And these cascading contagion of issues are much more complicated to deal with than just the technical bits. So in some ways, this is a real problem for geologists, because we're really good at maybe focusing on these geoscience technical aspects. But actually, if we want to say, for example, that we'll study and help with earthquake risk, you have to get involved in the politics of it all, because corruption is one of the issues that ends up houses and buildings being built very poorly in the way that people have materials. And we don't see that as part of geology, but that's a critical aspect. So I think these multi-complex systemic risks is what is going to be the story of the 21st century. And those systemic risks are causing business and finance, things that happen in the natural world very quickly move into the economic world as well. And we're seeing it, we're all in lockdown now for something exactly like that.
Yeah, sorry. So I guess the next question I had written down here was, what initiatives are there already underway to address this? And by address this, I mean kind of address the perception, the negative perception as I see it of mining. There seem to me to be quite a few groups around doing different things, and we're trying to do our own thing. But I just wonder whether there's a better way of coordinating it. I mean, I don't know who's the best person to ask. I mean, Alice, do you know what sort of initiatives are underway by different people, or
yeah, it's the whole sort of ethos behind ICMM, Mike, to collaborate as an industry to improve its reputation, to gain the trust of society back. Like that's the whole focus of ICMM, is to bring together the big players in the industry. And we've got performance expectations, we've got mission statements and various other bits on the website that sort of are something for the members to pin their hat to and say, this is what we're signed up for, this is how we're going to responsibly mine, look after the environment and look after our communities.
Yeah, I mean, since we've sort of looking at it a bit more seriously in SRK, and we've spoken to various organisations who are all kind of doing similar things in similar ways, or looking at this in similar ways. I see Christopher Reeves on the line, and he's got a group called Responsible Reserves, and looking at whether all the factors that should be taken into account when reporting resources and reserves, some of the softer issues, whether the social environmental impacts are such that we shouldn't be reporting resources, we shouldn't be encouraging it, we should be introducing those sort of concepts into reporting. And we've also spoken to the critical minerals group, who are trying to improve the perception, public knowledge, as James was saying, of the different minerals that we now need to build the things that we need to for wind turbines and phones and so on and so forth, to make people understand the importance of mining. But are there any other groups that we're aware of as a group that are doing work to? I mean, does the IMM? I mean, GeolStock has held a few conferences. Geological Society has held a few conferences in this area. Are there any other organisations we're aware of that are trying to address this issue?
Mike, one thing I would say perhaps is that there's a variety of different organisations and platforms, and we've spoken to a few SRK in the recent weeks, but there's ICMM, CMA, GeolSoc, the NHM, but there's we've also probably got to be aware that as geologists we're talking to these groups and we know of their existence, but are any of those groups actually in the public consciousness, and are they actually promoted in the mass media and available to Joe Public, who has absolutely no background in geology or mining? And if not, what will be the platform for that? And it probably needs to be one single platform that all of those different groups can feed into, because we're probably not going to have much luck if there's loads of different groups and platforms all trying to reach, mass media and the public separately.
Yeah, to me, it's somehow, how do we take advantage of this? There's no doubt there is some, as we said earlier on, if you're talking about volcanoes or dinosaurs, there is an enthusiasm in the public for those sorts of geological issues. And I think, if we can somehow capture, and we know that when, Dippy the dinosaur went on tour and came to the museum in Cardiff, there were more people that went to that museum in one day than had been there in the previous 3 months. So, somehow we've got to leverage off that enthusiasm for geology and teach them a bit more about mining along the way, I think. It's how we do that, I guess, is the challenge.
For me, I think it's about capturing the imagination. I mean, I think that, what we've all picked up on was we've either been introduced to somebody or, something that is hooked us on geoscience and made us, converted us really into this. And I think that's the area where we really need to kind of devote our attention. What are the things that are going to genuinely excite the world? I mean, if you're trying to tell an 18-year-old what to go into, and they've got that choice of synthetic biology, quantum computing, or mining, why should they go into mining? What is the reason they should go into mining? I think we need to really demonstrate that. And for me, it's because these are some of the critical issues. Some of them are existential that we're going to face. They're really complicated. And so trying to highlight the big picture excitement and difficulty, the sheer challenge of some of this stuff is one of the ways. Now, I have to say, the way that I think hasn't really been developed is this idea of the subsurface, the geology is the science of the subsurface. It was interesting in the GeolSoc post that came out recently that was mentioned earlier. I looked at that and it looked like geography. It had mountains and rivers, and there was a little bit of the subsurface with carbon capture and stuff like that. And to my mind, that creates the wrong sense. It's about saying there's a frontier down there that is really critical to the survival of humanity. Why are we going to have to terraform Mars when actually we're sitting on top of this amazing resource base? But how do we do it? And we are explorers. That's what we do. And something like that really galvanizes and catalyzes interest is what we need, rather than just showing how useful we are, or the fact that a certain material that we get creates something that people use every day. That's interesting, but it's not astonishing, and it's not something that's going to make someone change their whole career path.
Does anyone else want to add to that? Mark, maybe?
I was trying to think of something clever to say. and I was thinking, I was thinking, Ian, really, you're the chap who's got a bit of a public profile. You need to be out there saying something clever to the public.
Well, it's kind of funny because it was in the early years, it was dead easy because geology was so unfamiliar to people. You could surprise them about anything. Yeah. It's a little bit harder now. And I think one of the things is, how do we've done all the easy tricks. How do we pull out the things that are this business about the real challenges? And that's why I think that for many people, the real challenge is about how are we going to live a life in 2050, 2035, etc. And why is geoscience going to be absolutely critical to that? And until we've thought about what life's going to be like in 2035 or 2050, we don't really know which bit of geoscience to do. But I think you can make some guesses. You could be saying whatever it is, we're going to need what's down there. And geology is the only science that deals with that. All the rest of them, it's a concatenation of different sciences. But pretty much, if you go, more than 10 meters down, it is geology that does that. So that's why I think there's something to be done. It's not the only frame that I think there is there, but I think it's better than just harping on about dinosaurs and volcanoes. Which I've made a whole living of. So, for example, I should be careful what I say. Or mountains, sorry, Mike.
Mike, thank you very much for bringing together an impressive group of speakers and who addressed the issues of improving the public perception of mining. What are your main takeaways from today's meeting? What are your thoughts? What are you suggestions. What do you think should be done as far as improving the public perception of mining, not just among the miners and investors, but among the larger stakeholder groups and potential students?
Well, first of all, Arthur, thank you very much for organising the webinar, and also thanks to the speakers who all contributed. I think it was great. I think what the discussion did do is it just confirmed my view that there is a very poor public perception of the mining industry, and that this is having impacts on the industry. Fewer and fewer people studying geology and mining, and more people going off into other industries. Not just more people, but also the better people. I think also the discussion showed that there are a lot of initiatives already underway to try and address this and try to improve this perception. And a lot of people working in a lot of different organizations with the same aim. But it also showed that there's still quite a long way to go, and the more people we can get involved in the discussion, the better. I think the probably a big issue for mining is to try to convey to the public the importance of the industry. There are a huge number of things that people take for granted in their lives that completely rely on metals and minerals being mined from underground and processed and delivered. And I don't think there's a very good understanding of that. I think that's what we have to get across. I don't think that the current situation with the virus is going to impact on that. Maybe it's going to make travel very difficult for a long time, and that's going to impact on a lot of people, certainly in the mining industry. But no, I think the biggest issue really for us is just trying to explain to people how important mining is. So please watch the webinar, contact the speakers with your comments on the issues raised, and put those issues up on the webinar landing page.
Thank you, Mike. For now, let's hope the current situation will end soon, and we'll see each other in person.
I look forward to it, Arthur.
Thank you.